Welcome, everyone. Hello, thanks so much for joining us today. All right, wonderful. Well, welcome to today's webinar on the Statewide Cooperative Partnership for Local and Regional Markets. My name is Kate Siebold. I work at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and I'm one of the members of the core project team for this work. And I'm really excited to see all of you joining us for the conversation today. So before we get started, I just want to note that this webinar is being recorded so that we can post this recording to our website afterwards for people to view the presentation who aren't able to make it today. So under state law, the recording of this session will be available to anyone who asks for it as well. And then I know many of you are probably familiar with Zoom these days, but just a few Zoom reminders before we get started as well. Please do keep yourself muted during the presentation today, just so that everyone can hear what is being shared. We will have time for question and answers at the end of the session, and you can unmute yourself then. We also encourage you to use the chat. So as we're going through our presentation today, please feel free to put questions in the chat. We will, unless it's a quick response, we will save that and address the question at the end. But if you put it in the chat, we will make our way back to it. And then also, if there's any other technical issues that you're having, feel free to mention that in the chat. And then during the question and answer period, you're welcome to raise your hand under the reactions if you want to ask a question. And you're also welcome to share other reactions during the presentation as well. So our plan for today is we have 1 hour, and we're going to give a brief introduction to the Statewide Cooperative Partnership for Local and Regional Markets. If any of you joined for our first webinar session last week, this will be a little bit of a repeat, but we do want to provide that introductory information just so we are all on the same page as we head into our data discussion today. And then we're going to dig into data. And we have 5 different data themes that we'll be covering today. And then we'll have time at the end for question and answer. So we would love to hear from all of you. So if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, we would appreciate that. You can share your name, your organization or farm or business if you're affiliated with one, and then where you're calling in from today would be great. And while all of you introduce yourself in the chat, our core team will just introduce themselves briefly. So again, I'm Kate. I work at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture on this project, as well as other wholesale market development efforts, including farm to school. And I will pass it to Lebo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lebo Moore. I work with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture Produce Safety Program and the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program. And I'll kick it over to Hikaru.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hikaru Peterson. I'm in the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus. And pass it on to Casey.
Hi, I'm Casey McNichols, and I'm also in the Department of Applied Economics as a grad student, and I work as a research assistant on this project.
Great, thanks team. And thank you everyone for introducing yourself in the chat. Really exciting to see folks from all over joining us today. So let's dig in. Some of you are perhaps familiar with the Statewide Cooperative Partnership, and for others, this may be a brand new thing. And so we want to share a little bit about what this project is and how it got started. So the purpose of the Statewide Cooperative Partnership is to establish baseline data of local and regional markets, and then be able to respond to market issues and needs by pursuing a collaborative approach for dedicated, ongoing local and regional market support in Minnesota. And this project is truly a collaborative effort. It's led by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the University of Minnesota, but we have over 40 different partner organizations that have been involved in this project over the last 3 years. And we're really grateful for each and every one of our partners since they have all contributed a lot to this work. So these are a few of the partners that you see here on the screen. And throughout this project, we've really wanted to dedicate time to building relationships between all of these different partner organizations and think about, what does collaborative market support and development look like around Minnesota? And so each of these partners bring a really valuable perspective and area of expertise to that work. So our project is a 3-year project right now that's funded by a USDA Federal State Marketing Improvement Program grant. And the first year of our project in 2020 was really focused on gathering what's known about Minnesota's local and regional markets. So we did background research, an asset mapping exercise with our partners, and we also did a round of small community connector contracts with partner organizations to collect community knowledge that could inform this project as it was being developed. And then in our second year, we really focused on data collection, and we conducted 3 surveys, which you're going to hear a little bit more about from Hikaru and Casey after this. So we did a producer survey to producers who are selling into local and regional markets in Minnesota, who are small, mid-sized, and emerging. We also did a supply chain survey to entities that are making, selling, or distributing food in the state. And then finally, we surveyed consumers, so people who live in Minnesota or who are working in Minnesota and buying food here from our local and regional markets. And so with all this data that we collected in year 2, we're now in our 3rd and final year of this project where we're really looking ahead together. So we're sharing out this new data, and this webinar is one of the first ways that we're kind of publicly sharing this data, and we're really excited to be able to share it with so many people, and that will continue to be a focus moving forward. And then in the process of sharing out this data, we're also looking to collect input from partners and community members on what this data is telling us so that we can really think collaboratively about how to put this data into action in a way that will achieve what we all are wanting to see in Minnesota's local and regional markets. And one way we're doing that is to identify action priorities, which are meant to be informed by the data that we've collected and serve as priorities for all of the different partners in this cooperative partnership to work on local and regional market development. And so those action priorities are going to be the focus of next week's webinar. That's our 3rd and final part of this webinar series. So we're going to be sharing out those action priorities and looking to collect input from all of you and others that joined that day. And then finally, from this project, we will be putting together a final report and making recommendations to policymakers on what are the ways that we can strengthen Minnesota's local and regional markets and create more equitable access for producers to those markets. So we did produce an interim legislative report this past February, and this came at the request of the legislature, and it is available online for anyone who's interested in reading it, and it provides a really great slightly more in-depth overview of kind of the background and history of this project, and then it lays out the work that we completed in years 1 and 2, as well as those plans for this 3rd year. And then we also made interim recommendations. So kind of just past the halfway mark of this project, what were recommendations that we had based on what we'd learned so far through this project. And so if you're looking to learn a little bit more about this project, I recommend that you take a look at that legislative report. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Hikaru to share more about the data collection process.
Thank you, Kate. And so the baseline data collection was the year 2 activity, but you can see that it actually took a little bit more than a year to get this all. As Kate explained, there were 3 surveys that we administered to the producers, supply chain businesses, and consumers. And you can see the timeline that we tackled this development of the survey and also distributing as well. And for each of the surveys, we had great input from the partners and the project team. And also, as Kate mentioned, that with the distribution of these surveys as well, there's a lot of partners who helped us get these surveys to the folks that we were targeting, and so we really appreciate that. And just to kind of give a reminder again of who our target audience was, the producers surveys were targeting anyone in Minnesota who sells approximately $500 or more in agricultural products in a given year. And this cutoff is lower than the 1,000 that is used for agricultural census. But again, our target here was to generate a data set and understanding of producers who were small in scale, perhaps emerging, and therefore we feel like this cutoff was appropriate to do that. The supply chain businesses were fielded to individuals, businesses, and organizations, and also institutions such as schools and hospitals that did anything with the food, that they would purchase food, agricultural products from farmers and then sell in a food form to Minnesotans. And then the consumers were, the criteria was anybody who resided or worked in Minnesota and did their food shopping primarily in Minnesota. And we made sure that the demographic was representative of the Minnesota population as a whole. And just to kind of tell you that these are very different surveys, and we ended up with a very different sample size. And so for the producers, we ended up with 497 responses. The supply chain businesses that ended up with a usable response was 37. And then we have 820 responses for the consumer survey. And with all this data, today we can only highlight. And so we do have a plan to make sure that this data is accessible to the public for folks to use, whether they're trying to make a case or trying to write a proposal. And so for the consumer survey, we're planning to make the anonymized data fully available through the data repository at the University of Minnesota. And so folks can just go in, it's a URL, and you can download the whole thing. There'll be explanation about the different items that are included. The supply chain survey, due to the small sample, we can't make the entire data available, but we will. We're in the process of developing a report with a item-by-item response to each of the survey questions. And then for the producer survey, we will generate a similar report where you can look at the responses to each item that was included in the survey, but we're also in the process of developing some sort of regional specific summaries so that, again, it could be most usable for folks who might be interested in using our data to further your activities. And we're also looking into options for trying to tell more intuitive stories around the data, and so that we can make sure that the storylines that are emerging from our data can be made more accessible.
Thanks, Hikaru. So we, the Statewide Cooperative Partnership, gathered in February for a data party and workshop, and this was kind of the first gathering of having people kind of come together to look at this data that had been collected. And so the data placemats that we're going to be sharing with you today are kind of some of the data graphics came from the data party. And then we're also going to be sharing some of the takeaways or discussion points that came up from this data party as well. So this data party, again, was about 50 different partners and food systems leaders that came together over 2 days. The first day was spent sitting at tables like you see here, just looking at the data and talking about it and thinking about, what do we see in the data? What's missing? What questions do we have? And then the second day was spent thinking about, now that we looked at the data, what do we want to do? And so what specifically, the questions we asked were specifically, what do we want to start doing? What do we want to stop doing? What do we want to sustain or keep doing? And what do we want to change? And so that day 2 part with actions is what has informed our action priorities that we'll be sharing at next week's webinar. We do have a very brief video that it's like a 1-minute trailer that kind of shows a preview of kind of what that data party looked like. And so we're just going to share that. And then after today, we'll send out the full, the slides from this and then the full video. We're going to see if we can get the audio playing. Lebo, our tech person, is attempting it. So we'll see if you can watch it.
The Statewide Cooperative Partnership is a collective effort between the state and university and more than 40 partner organizations to gather baseline data on Minnesota's local and regional markets that can be used to support market access and development for Minnesota farmers. In February of 2023, the partnership came together for a 2-day data party and workshop at the Wilder Foundation. This meeting was the culmination of 2 years of relationship building, knowledge gathering, and data collection. It was also the kickoff for the partnership's next phase of work to build a vision and identify strategies for supporting local and regional market development in Minnesota.
So again, that's just the short version. We have, it's about a 6-minute video that we can share after this, but kind of a lot of the format and concepts that we're sharing today in this webinar series came from that data party. And I think, you know, the hope for this webinar series is to kind of be able to engage an even wider audience of folks that weren't able to attend in person to collect more input on what we're seeing in this data, and also just make sure that people know this data exists in ways that they can use it. So with that, we will dig into some of the data that we have planned for you today.
Great. So we had 12 data summaries or placemats or posters, however you want to call them, that we prepared for the data party. And we wanted the attendants to collectively process the data. And for this webinar series, we're covering the highlights from these data summaries in 2 webinars. The one that was last week that will have the recording available for those of you who missed it, and then also today. And so for today, the plan is that we will cover the 5 data themes like Kate introduced, but I think it is really important for us to review who responded to our surveys first. And so again, if those of you who were with us last week, it's a little bit repetitive, but we'd like to give a quick overview so that we're all familiar with who our participants were. And I'm going to ask Casey to take it over.
Hi, so I'm just going to provide a quick overview of the participating producers in the producer survey. So we had a total response of 497 producers, which represents about 1% of the number of producers filling out the 2017 Ag Census. And only about 37% of the producers in our sample indicated that they had filled out the 2017 Ag Census. So we're catching a lot of people who may not have been represented in that existing data. On average, the operations in the producer survey were a lot smaller than those in the Ag Census, with an average acreage of about 81 acres versus the 371 acres in the Ag Census. And we also had a much higher proportion of historically underrepresented producers. We had about 57% of the producers were new and beginning farmers, which is defined as those farming for less than or for 10 years or less, as opposed to the 21% in the Ag Census. We also had about 29% of the producers were producers of color, as opposed to the 1% in the Ag Census. So really the sample is looking a little different than the Ag Census and is operating in different spaces, you know, more producers selling directly to consumers and operating organic operations. Our supply chain survey, again, was much smaller in scope and represented about 37 organizations that fulfilled operations including processing, food manufacturing, distribution, wholesale, warehousing, retail, and food service, as well as some institutions like schools represented in our data. We had a large range of the business scale, from very tiny businesses to extremely large businesses, with an average number of employees being 80 and the average total cost of goods and food of $2.4 million. And these businesses served a really broad variety of customers, including schools, restaurants, distributors, and individual consumers. They also used a broad variety of suppliers, including directly from ag producers, wholesalers, food hubs, retail stores, et cetera. And then finally, our consumer survey was a very large sample of about 800 responses. And we worked with Qualtrics to make sure that those filling out the survey were fairly representative of the population of Minnesota. So this chart, or this slide, has a bunch of charts just comparing our respondents to the total population of Minnesota. So you can see that we have people filling this out from all around the state, with a broad variety in age that roughly matches the population, as well as household income and race and ethnicity. The one thing I do want to point out is that we had a slightly higher representation of people who'd fulfilled a lot of educational or had a high level educational attainment, which is slightly different than the population of Minnesota.
Yeah, so let's jump into the first data theme, which is about demand for and expectations of local foods. And so I'm sure all of us who are here today think that local and regional foods are important and great, but it's really helpful to ground truth this with the public. And we asked the same question at the state fair as well, but it is really good to have this validated with the representative sample. And so when you're asked, we're basically asking, like, do you agree or disagree with the statement, when purchasing food, I care where it is grown? And combining the strongly agree and somewhat agree responses, 61% of the consumers do in fact care where their food is grown. So why is it that consumers care about where their food comes from? Well, we asked respondents to compare local foods, however they define it at this point, from foods that are sourced from non-local places. And you can see the different attributes that we asked about, like affordability or availability in times of crisis and so forth. And in the chart here, the brighter green and the blue implies that they think local is better, and then yellow being the neutral or no different. And so for most attributes, they think that local is better. At the very bottom, the last two attributes there are additives and GMOs. And so thus you see the proportions of responses in reverse, that they think that the local foods are less in less use of additives and less use of genetically modified ingredients. And so the four attributes that the consumers believe in that the local foods are better are in terms of community impact, quality, flavor, and the environmental impact. And as I said, that the most attributes they think local is better, and this includes affordability, where 36% think that they're better, the locals are better, and then 26% are responding that they think that they're not doing as well. These two charts summarize how consumers on the left, and then in the middle, the supply chain businesses define local foods. And you see that the main thing is that they define local very differently. And so on the left pie chart among the consumers, we asked, what is the most encompassing definition of local food that they would use? And 58% of the respondents associated with the state of Minnesota, which is helpful in a sense that is an administrative unit that's very well defined, and we can work with this. You can also see some responses about, within certain miles of where I live or where they buy. The responses to that on average was around 75 to 80, with a median of 50 miles for both. And so I think it's kind of intuitive that we're basically talking about a radius of about an hour drive when people are thinking about local foods in terms of mileage. In contrast, if you ask the supply chain businesses and institutions, you see that on the top, which is the all response, the 37 responses, only 30% associate local with the state of Minnesota, which I'm sorry, we asked them in a different way, so it's not corresponding, but it's the dark green block that's like fourth item that is in the legend there. And you can see the little breakdown depending on what part of the supply chain they function, but there's definitely a different disconnect between, Minnesota is local for 58% of the consumers, but only 30% of the businesses. Here's another comparison between consumers and supply chain businesses about their attitude or preferences towards local and regional foods. So on the left, consumers are asked how much they're willing to pay for certain products over products with unknown origins. And so you see at the top, it's their response for local foods compared to products with unknown origins. The second bar is Minnesota grown products compared to unknown origins and so forth. So on average, consumers are willing to pay 33% premium for local food products over products that with unknown origins. But on the right, summarizes the supply chain businesses' response on how much they think that their customers are willing to pay for Minnesota-sourced food products over the price they typically pay. And you see that, again, we're looking at a much smaller magnitude, 10%. And so consumers are roughly, willing to pay 3 times more for local foods than the supply chain businesses think that they're willing to pay. And it's true that, the supply chain businesses serve various type of customers, but most of them do work with individual customers. And so there's definitely a disconnect in understanding how much the end users are willing to pay for local foods. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate for some of the other thoughts that emerged at the data party.
Yeah, so these are just a few of kind of the discussion takeaways or topics that came up at the data party with those who attended. And I think that Hikar and Casey touched on many of these, but some things that really stood out in conversation in looking at this data with attendees was, again, that consumers are willing to pay 33% more, while supply chain businesses assume consumers are only willing to pay about 10%. And so there was a lot of interest in that disconnect. And, is it on the consumer side or the supply chain partner side, a little bit of both, and just in general interest in kind of diving into that disconnect more. We also, talked about just the fact that local foods have very different definitions according to nearly all the different groups surveyed. And also that fresh and healthy meant more to some consumers than local. Another interesting point was that consumers did not necessarily perceive local foods as presenting a lower risk to foodborne illness, but overwhelmingly thought that local food had a higher quality. So just some really interesting things to consider when we think about how we promote or look to engage people with local foods and build that expectation based on kind of what they're thinking about local food.
So next I'm going to talk about the local food promotion and Minnesota Grown program. And this section really came from all 3 surveys and asked producers about their involvement with Minnesota Grown, and then supply chain partners and consumers about their interactions with and perceptions of the Minnesota Grown program and local foods. So this first slide focuses on this area from the producer side. We can see that about 65% of the producers who participated in the producer survey were individually members of the Minnesota Grown program, and then about 8% were members as organizations. So we had a really high rate of people being involved with the program represented in our data. We also asked them some questions asking about the value of the program and whether they found it worthwhile investing as a producer. And we see that about 44% said it was somewhat valuable and 47% said it was an extremely valuable program. This indicates that this program is really worth investing in from the producer side. We also asked some questions to the consumers and supply chain businesses. So on the left, we asked consumers whether they were familiar with the Minnesota Grown program, and about 80% of consumers either recognized the Minnesota Grown program or were directly involved with the Minnesota Grown program. In contrast, we can see that some of the supply chain organizations underestimated whether their consumers knew about the Minnesota Grown program or recognized the logo. In particular, the food service providers believe that only 66% of their customers would recognize the Minnesota Grown program logo. So this shows a little disconnect between perceptions from the supply chain side versus what's actually going on with the consumers. And then finally, this shows a little more data from the consumer side. So on the left, we asked what quality expectations people had of Minnesota grown products. And some key things that jumped out were that people thought these products were fresh, local, healthy, and generally related to community, and were sometimes believed to be more nutritious or sustainable. We also asked consumers whether they believed that Minnesota grown products should be grown and raised locally or processed locally. For example, you'd have like, locally made cheese that's made using milk from non-local cows versus products that are grown and raised and processed, where you'd have to be using inputs and processing products in Minnesota for it to be considered a Minnesota grown products. And you can see that there's a split between consumers about their perception of what Minnesota grown should mean. But in general, consumers on average thought that Minnesota grown products should be 77% sourced from Minnesota.
Great. So again, just to kind of summarize some points that Casey touched on that came up in discussion at the data party, that the data was showing that Minnesota grown membership is seen as valuable to producers, and that the program is an asset for other agricultural products than just vegetables. But there was also discussion on, just noting that this data that was collected was not representative of all Minnesota farmers, and in particular, a lack of Indigenous, BIPOC, and Amish voices in the data, and so wanting additional data to be able to look into this even more. We also talked about that consumers are aware of the Minnesota grown brand, even if they aren't necessarily sure how or where they've seen it. And that then there was interest in looking into, who are the consumers that are aware or engaged versus not engaged. There was some interesting discussion, around some folks being surprised and others not surprised around the idea that, sustainability or organic production is not a primary expectation of Minnesota grown products or the logo. Similarly, there was some surprise that the cost of membership was not a significant reason for not renewing membership from producers, while others found that percentage to be, of importance to discuss. And then something that did come out of the conversation was a clear need for translation for the program materials and outreach materials to be translated into other languages.
All right, let's move on to the third theme on food safety. And so we, in the all surveys, producers, supply chain businesses, and consumers, we included items that were related to food safety, but here we'll just kind of highlight responses from the producers and then also consumers as well. And so here is a question about, whether the producers perceive returns to investment in on-farm food safety practices. And 61% say yes, but then there's a solid, 23% who say they don't perceive positive returns on such investment. And just to contrast the similar response to Minnesota Grown program that Casey kind of alluded to, where 80% thought that it was valuable and whatnot, there might be a room to better demonstrate the value of food safety practices and or reduce the financial burden for producers. And now to the consumer side, we asked their familiarity with food safety related terms, such as like cottage food or custom exempt. And of course, if you're in food safety, these are very, everyday words, but clearly it's not for the general public. So here in the bright green is the never heard of this term until now. And you see that it's about, 50% for most of these terms. And so if they're not familiar with the terms, they're also not familiar with the regulations as well. But to the right, it is capturing the response about how consumers think about how much regulatory oversight is contributing to food safety. And here, if you combine the responses for a moderate amount to a lot to a great deal, 81% of consumers are saying that the regulatory oversight is definitely contributing to our food safety. Parallel to their unfamiliarity with these food safety related terms, the majority of consumers seem not to be concerned with food safety risks. It could very well be that our industry does such an awesome job taking care and making sure that our food is primarily safe. But across different products, you don't see like a huge alarm on the perceived risks that they might be perceiving. So the products with moderate or greater perceived risk, so where I'm kind of combining the yellow and then the darker shades of green and blue responses, you see the highest percentages for the raw and unpasteurized dairy products, followed by raw poultry and raw meat.
So just, a few things to kind of underscore is we talked about the 61% of producers who reported positive returns in food safety practices. Some attendees really that resonated with their experience and what they've heard from some farmers in taking pride in their food safety practices. But there was an interest in hearing more from that 61% who do see positive returns, but also learning more about those who are not seeing a positive return and digging into the data a bit on both sides of that statistic. And then really just a great discussion around what does food safety really mean to consumers, and how does organic versus non-organic impact food safety perceptions, and just kind of what does that meaning really mean when we see that many of the consumers are unfamiliar with some of the food safety terms that are often used. And then finally, just really more interest in further in-depth analysis, particularly on the producer side in this area, looking at like farm size and demographics as well.
So our next section is the local food supply chain section, and this focused on local food supply chains, as well as how businesses are making decisions about sourcing their fresh food products. So this first chart looks at this from the supply chain side. So the chart on the left asks about the ways that businesses prefer to source their fresh food products. So we can see that about 51% of the businesses indicated that they prefer to source their fresh food products directly from individual producers. And this percent is even higher for those operating in the distribution, wholesale, warehousing, and retail spaces. So these are the green bars the farthest to the left are the people who are indicating they want to source from individual producers. On the right, we see the distribution of the total cost of goods in the fresh food category across suppliers. Right now, we can see that ag producers make up about 31% of the total cost of goods, or about $30.9 million. Distributors, warehousing, and wholesale are making up the largest share with about 38% or $37.4 million in the total cost of goods. We also asked some questions about what requirements businesses have when they're buying fresh food products directly from producers. And this chart on the left is a select all question asking about which of the requirements the businesses require are met by the individual producers. So from this, we can see that the key requirements are things like the food safety plan, which was required by 61% of businesses, liability insurance, and on-farm visits, which were required by about 30% of businesses. In contrast, very few businesses are requiring worker training or water tests. And we're seeing that not all of the businesses are requiring things like GAP or good handling practice audits for produce products. We also asked some questions about what attributes businesses found were important to have successful relationships with those suppliers of their farm products. And from this chart, we can see that a lot of people are indicating that things about quality are really important to them. So 100% of the respondents indicated that consistency in product quality and then product quality were either extremely important, which is in green, or very important to them. Something that's also interesting is that price did not come up as like the #1 most important driver of the successful relationship. So this shows that there's a space for individual producers to build relationships through things like being more convenient or being more reliable or having higher quality products.
So a few takeaways that data party attendees saw in this data was, again, that the most important factors for buyers when sourcing local products are consistent quality and adequate supply, and that these two factors outweighed kind of logistical barriers of purchasing, such as like communication or transportation. And price was also not the most important factor, but some did feel like it still came through as a deal breaker for buying local products. And then again, few buyers having food safety requirements besides specialty crops also stood out. And then one thing that did come up in some of the data was just a discussion around some buyers being interested in sourcing more products, particularly in food service, but trying to dig into the why around that.
All right, and then let's jump into the final data theme, which is consumer access to local foods. And so we first asked them like where they buy food. and so on the left, you see that different types of food stores where consumers say they purchased within the last 6 months of the time that they were completing this survey. And you see that the majority of folks shop at supercenters or big box stores with grocery section. Think, Target and Walmart, and then supermarkets followed by that. So Cub Foods, for example, and then also followed by membership club stores like Sam's Club, and then the convenience store, corner stores, and or pharmacy. So in the middle panel, what it's showing is whether folks have experience in purchasing Minnesota origin food products or not. And what we want to focus here is the response in yellow, where they're saying they're not sure. and it's basically indicating that the store outlets are not doing a very good job conveying the source information to their customers. And so the places where most people are unsure about the food origin are the membership club stores at 41%, and then the supercenters and other big stores with a grocery section at 38%. And as you can see, those are the places where most people shop for food. Similarly, we ask consumers to rank the availability of, quote, local foods, again, however they define local, at the places where they regularly shop. And so you see that the excellent is the light green, and then it progressively goes down to poor as the color shade darken. And so if we actually look at the top four, where again, where the outlets where most consumers shop for their food, you see that that's where we have a huge percentage of dark responses, which are suggesting that they are the lowest scores. And the supermarkets are spared relative to the other places, but again, it's no denying that they can do better in terms of availability of local foods. So the question is like, how much are consumers like open to changing? And so we asked about the satisfaction question, like how satisfied are you with your own local food consumption? And you see that for extremely and regularly satisfied response, or half of the folks are satisfied with their local food consumption, with only 15% combined response saying that they're dissatisfied. And I think we can debate whether these numbers show that there's room for improvement or there's little room for improvement, because only 15% of the population are dissatisfied with how they're consuming foods. But assuming that they are interested in increasing their local food consumption, we ask them about the questions on the levers of change. And so in the next slide, here are some hints on which levers might be most effective in changing consumers' behavior. And so, again, we have different conditions. So for example, like if I knew the farmer or the food maker, I would buy more local options in all of these items, or if, certain conditions are met, I would buy more local options. And what it seems to be suggesting is that the most effective levers are at the bottom, which is if, local options were cheaper, so the lower price would be helpful. But also the next largest collection of the green and blue response is that a greater variety of local options are available at stores that I regularly shop at.
Great. So a few takeaways from this section was just the need or value in getting more local food into the stores where people already shop. So as Sakara mentioned, those membership stores or larger stores where people are already doing their primary grocery shopping. There was also discussion around more education about how and where to buy local food. There was also discussion around food access versus food purchases and wanting more information about residents' use of food shelves and community gardens, including typical barriers to food access, time, transportation, cooking equipment, language. And then also, there was discussion around access to culturally specific local food as well in the context of this broader conversation. So with that, those were all 5 of our data themes today, and we do have some time for questions. But before we get to that, we just first off want to say thank you so much for joining us today to look at this data and be a part of this conversation. We're really excited to have this data and to be able to share it out and hear from folks like all of you around what you're seeing in this data and how you'd like to see it put into action. So we hope that you will join us next week for our part 3 of this webinar series, where we will be providing an introduction to the action priorities that we've put together based on the ideas generated at the February data party and workshop. And in presenting that, we'll then have a few different ways for you to provide feedback on those action priorities. Since greater public input is really valuable for us to put these action priorities together before we finalize them, since the hope is that these priorities can really serve to guide the work of MDA and University of Minnesota, but also many of our partner organizations as well. So we hope that you will join us next week. If you haven't registered yet, please do. And with that, I think we can head into the question and answer portion.